Once, this land echoed with the iron rhythm of Roman order. Legionaries marched beneath scarlet standards. Latin prayers filled marble temples, and aqueducts carried water to shining towns. But by the early 5th century, those echoes had faded. The eagles of Rome had flown home, their empire collapsing under its own weight. Britain, once a distant jewel in Rome's crown, was now abandoned, its villas crumbling, its soldiers gone, its people afraid. The towns that once bustled with merchants and governors became ghostly shells. Roads fell to mud, walls to ivy. It was as though civilization itself had drawn a final breath and then simply stopped. You can almost hear the wind whispering through the ruins, carrying both memory and warning something is coming. In this void of power, the native Britons tried to stand on their own. Romanized lords clung to old customs. They wore togas as their fathers had, still addressed each other in broken Latin, still pretended that the empire might return. But across the sea, beyond the gray waters of the north, new forces were stirring. Along the flat coasts of what is now Denmark and northern Germany, entire peoples faced their own kind of collapse. The climate had turned colder, harvests failed, and the sea, once generous, grew harsh and unpredictable. There, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, seafaring tribes hardened by hunger and salt wind, looked westward toward the island that glimmered on the horizon. To them, Britain was not a memory of empire. It was a promise. The first to arrive did not come as conquerors. They came as mercenaries. British kings, desperate to fend off raiders from the north and west, invited these warriors as hired swords, a decision that would change the island's fate forever. According to legend, two brothers led them, Hengist and Horsa, names half myth, half history. They came to fight for Britain and then decided to fight for themselves. The line between ally and invader vanished. Villages that once paid them tribute now burned under their torches. And soon, the rivers of the east carried more ships, more families, more warriors. Settlers began carving homes into the soil, raising timber halls where Roman villas had once stood. For the native Britons, this was not just invasion, it was erasure. The language of Latin retreated into silence, replaced by strange new words, sharp-edged and northern. The gods of Woden, Thunor, and Frigg arrived, driving out the old saints. The very name of the land began to shift from Britannia to England, the land of the Angles. It was as if a new world had stepped onto the ashes of the old, carrying both beauty and brutality in equal measure. Historians still argue whether these migrations were peaceful or apocalyptic, whether waves of settlers slowly blended with locals, or whether fire and sword swept the island clean. The truth, as always, likely lies between. What's certain is that a new people were being born, one neither Roman nor purely British, but something in between. And so, Britain entered the Age of Shadows. 1,000 small voices spoke across the mist. Stories of survival, betrayal, and change. Monasteries hid what knowledge they could. Warriors sang by firelight. Children grew up never knowing Rome's grandeur, only the raw, unshaped world they inherited. The whispers from the north grew louder, not just the sound of the sea, but of destiny itself. The Anglo-Saxons had arrived, and though they could not have known it, they were building the foundations of a new civilization. The stones of Rome had fallen, but out of those ruins, the first fragile outlines of England began to rise. The sea was their road, their teacher, their god. Long before maps bore the name England, sleek wooden ships cut across the gray expanse between the Danish and English coasts, their sails swollen with wind and promise. On board, men, women, and children clung to few possessions, carved amulets, iron tools, and the memory of home. You can almost feel the cold spray of the North Sea on your face, hear the rhythmic creak of oars, and sense the tension between fear and hope. These were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, travelers from lands that had grown too small and too harsh. They did not come all at once, nor under one banner. Instead, they arrived in waves, family by family, tribe by tribe, drawn toward a land left hollow by the collapse of Rome, a land they could call their own. At first, their presence seemed harmless, even useful. The native Britons, struggling against the raids of Picts from the north and Irish pirates from the west, welcomed these strong seafarers as allies. The chronicler Gildas, writing a century later, claimed that Britain's kings offered the newcomers land in exchange for protection. And for a while, it worked. The Anglo-Saxons built forts, patrolled borders, and kept the raiders at bay. They shared meals, traded goods, and learned the local terrain. Yet beneath the fragile peace simmered distrust. The newcomers outnumbered their hosts, their warriors restless and proud. When the promised supplies failed, or the land seemed too little, the swords they had raised for Britain turned against it. The stories of Hengist and Horsa, half myth and half warning, tell of how quickly alliances shattered. Invited as saviors, they became conquerors. Towns that once bore Roman names were renamed in strange northern tongues. Kent, Sussex, and Essex, the kingdoms of the South Saxons, East Saxons, and more, began to take shape. Smoke rose from villages that resisted, and fields once tilled by Britons now belonged to the strangers from across the sea. Still, the picture was not simple conquest. Archaeologists today find graves where Saxon and Briton lie side by side, suggesting marriages, trade, and cultural blending. Historians still argue whether this was invasion or migration, whether the native Britons were wiped out or slowly absorbed. But whatever the truth, by the late 5th century, the newcomers' influence had spread across the southern and eastern lands. The island was no longer Roman, and no longer wholly British either. Life for these settlers was raw and perilous, but rich in meaning. Their world revolved around kinship, loyalty, and survival. They lived in timber halls roofed with thatch, surrounded by fields of barley and rye. The smell of smoke and animal fat lingered in the air. In the evenings, warriors gathered around the fire, telling tales of gods who wielded thunder and wolves who devoured the Sunday. These myths were not entertainment. They were a code, a way to understand life and death. Each tribe carried its gods with them, Woden, Thunor, Tu, Frigg, spirits of strength and fate who demanded courage above all else. In a land of uncertainty, belief was both anchor and weapon. Over time, their settlements grew into kingdoms. The Jutes ruled in Kent, the Saxons in Wessex and Sussex, the Angles in East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Britain, once unified under Roman law, became a patchwork of small, rival realms, each one a blend of ambition and fear. The soil, soaked in centuries of conflict, gave birth to a new people who saw the world through firelight and storm. Their art was simple but powerful. Intricate brooches of gold and garnet, burial mounds filled with weapons and treasures for the afterlife. You can almost picture a chieftain's hall on a cold winter night laughter, the clinking of cups, the glint of steel by the hearth. Civilization had been reborn, not through marble and law, but through courage and memory. And yet, beneath their growing power, something deeper stirred a sense that this new world, still fragile, was being watched by older spirits. The ruins of Roman towns lay silent nearby, half buried but not forgotten. In those crumbling stones, the Anglo-Saxons must have seen ghosts not of men, but of empires. For now, their story was one of triumph and survival, but the shadow of destiny was already gathering. Across the seas they had crossed, new powers waited, waiting for their turn to test the newborn kingdoms of the English. The island was no longer a refuge. It was a battlefield, a chessboard carved from forests, rivers, and smoke. Out of the scattered settlements and tribal alliances, something larger began to take shape. The Anglo-Saxons, once wanderers, were now builders of nations. Yet their kingdoms were not born from peace, but from necessity. Survival required unity, and unity demanded strength. Across the patchwork of lands, chieftains rose and fell, each claiming descent from gods or heroes to legitimize their rule. Slowly, the first great kingdoms emerged: Kent, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, each glowing like a fragile ember in the darkness of post-Roman Britain. In Kent, the kingdom of the Jutes, civilization flickered back to life earliest. Its rulers, especially King Athelbert, reached beyond blood and blade. They sought structure, law, and order. It was here that the seeds of England's transformation were first planted. When the Christian missionary Augustine arrived from Rome in 597 AD, he found not barbarians, but a king ready to listen. The meeting between the Roman monk and the pagan ruler was more than a religious exchange. It was a moment that would alter the soul of a people. Augustine brought not only the gospel, but literacy, administration, and a sense of connection to a greater world. And as churches rose from timber and stone, the ancient gods began to fade into whispers. Still, the conversion was slow, often shallow, and always political. A ruler's faith was a tool, as much a shield as a confession. Further north, in the lands of the Angles, Northumbria became the beating heart of a new cultural dawn. Its twin powers, Bernicia and Deira, merged under ambitious kings like Edwin and Oswald, men whose lives would read like epics sung in the mead hall. The monks of Lindisfarne and Jarrow chronicled their deeds, building monasteries that became beacons of learning. Here, under candlelight, monks copied Latin manuscripts, illuminated with gold and lapis, even as warriors clashed outside their doors. The rhythm of the sword and the quill defined Northumbria's soul, fierce in spirit, yet yearning for wisdom. Historians still argue whether this was the first true English identity, born not from conquest, but from coexistence between pagan roots and Christian rebirth. To the west, the kingdom of Mercia grew under rulers like Penda and later Offa, the latter remembered for his mighty dike, a colossal earthen wall stretching across the borderlands, separating his realm from the Welsh tribes. Offa's dike still scars the landscape today, a silent monument to the ambition and insecurity of early kings. Mercia stood as the great power of central England, rich in trade, fierce in war, and skilled in diplomacy. Its courts heard both the thunder of warriors and the soft rustle of scribes. But even the greatest kings could not escape fate. Power in this age was fleeting, like sunlight through the mist. No realm held dominance for long. The tide always turned. Amid the rise of these kingdoms, daily life for the common people carried on in quiet persistence. Fields were plowed, cattle tended, and children raised beneath skies that knew both storm and peace. Villages grew around the halls of their lords, where disputes were settled and alliances forged over feasts. The people measured time by harvests and saints' days, their lives shaped by both the land and the will of their rulers. Women, though seldom mentioned in the chronicles, held power in the home, managing estates and weaving the threads of lineage that bound generations. In every hearth flickered not just warmth, but continuity, a stubborn defiance against the cold uncertainty of their world. The Anglo-Saxons forged more than kingdoms. They forged identity. Their language, once scattered dialects of the Germanic coast, began to merge into something new, Old English, the ancestor of the tongue that would one day tell their story. Their art, their laws, and even their burial customs blended past and present. From Sutton Hoo's ship burial, a masterpiece of gold and mystery, to the carved stone crosses that dotted the hills, the Anglo-Saxon imagination bridged two worlds, the pagan and the Christian, the earthly and the eternal. They were no longer outsiders. They were the makers of a new civilization. But with greatness comes envy, and with order comes vulnerability. For just as their ancestors once arrived from the sea, so too would new invaders rise from those same waters, fierce, relentless, and destined to test the strength of the kingdoms they had built. The dawn that once brought peace to Anglo-Saxon England now carried the scent of smoke and salt. It began quietly, a whisper on the northern wind, a rumor that men with axes and dragon-prowed ships were seen upon the waves. But soon, whispers turned to screams. In the summer of 793 AD, the storm arrived. The monks of Lindisfarne, who had devoted their lives to prayer and learning, looked up from their illuminated manuscripts to see the horizon aflame. The Vikings had come. They poured from their longships, like a living tide, men hardened by endless seas, wielding blades as bright as lightning. The Holy Island, cradle of English Christianity, was drenched in blood. Golden relics were plundered, sacred altars torn apart. One chronicler wrote that it seemed as though heathen men had desecrated God's dwelling. It was not just a raid, it was an omen. Across the coasts and rivers of England, terror spread. Villages burned overnight. Monasteries vanished into ruin. The Anglo-Saxons, who once believed themselves secure behind faith and fortifications, now faced a foe unlike any before, fast, organized, and utterly merciless. The Vikings struck without warning, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Their ships, shallow-bottomed and swift, could sail up rivers as easily as across seas. No place was truly safe, not even the heartlands. Historians still debate whether these early raids were the work of desperate men seeking wealth or the first ripples of a deliberate campaign of conquest. Whatever their intent, the impact was the same. Fear ruled the land, and beneath that fear, something else stirred resolve. In the kingdom of Wessex, the youngest of the Anglo-Saxon realms, the Viking threat became a crucible. The kings of Wessex, from Egbert to Alfred the Great, saw the storm not as an ending, but as a test of endurance. Alfred, in particular, would emerge as the soul of resistance, a man of learning and war, of patience and vision. When the great heathen army invaded in 865 AD, it was no longer a handful of raiders but an organized force bent on settlement and domination. Kingdom after kingdom fell: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, all crushed under the iron weight of Norse ambition. Only Wessex stood firm, and yet even Alfred would taste defeat. Driven into the marshes of Athelney, hunted and alone, he hid among his people, gathering what little strength remained. It was there, in the cold mists of exile, that the legend of Alfred was forged. As the story goes, one day he took shelter in a peasant woman's hut. Exhausted, he failed to watch the cakes she had set by the fire, and when they burned, she scolded him fiercely, not knowing she had chastised her king. That moment, small and humble, became a symbol of his humanity, his endurance. From those marshes, Alfred rose again. He reorganized his armies, fortified towns called burhs, and devised strategies that would outmatch the Viking horde. By 878 AD, at the Battle of Edington, he met the invaders under Guthrum and won a victory that changed history. The Vikings were forced to retreat, and soon after, an agreement was made, the Danelaw, dividing England into Saxon and Norse realms. It was peace born of exhaustion, yet it gave England time to breathe, to rebuild. But the Vikings did not vanish. They settled, married, and blended into the land they once sought to conquer. Their names, customs, and even words began to seep into English life. Towns like York, Grimsby, and Derby still bear their legacy. The Norse gods gave way to the Christian cross, but their spirit, adventurous, relentless, unyielding, found a home in the Anglo-Saxon heart. And in this unlikely fusion, something extraordinary began to take shape. A nation both scarred and strengthened by conflict. A people forged from two fires: Saxon endurance and Viking ferocity. Yet even as peace returned to the fields and villages, a shadow lingered. The land was divided not just by borders, but by identity. Who were the English now? Descendants of conquerors and conquered alike. They stood at a crossroads between chaos and unity. The kingdoms had weathered storms, but new ambitions stirred among their rulers, dreams of something greater, something eternal. The storm had passed, but its thunder still echoed in their blood. The next age would not be about mere survival. It would be about destiny. The dawn of England was near, but it would come at a cost of crowns, of faith, and of freedom itself. The smoke of war had cleared, but the land that remained was forever changed. From the ashes of kingdoms and the mingling of peoples, something new began to emerge, a fragile yet undeniable sense of unity. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, once separate tribes, had become threads in the same tapestry, woven together by shared suffering and hard-won peace. It was not the sword alone that forged England, but endurance, the quiet strength of a people who refused to vanish. Out of the shifting chaos of the 9th and 10th centuries, the dream of one kingdom began to take form, and at its heart stood a man who believed the island could be more than a patchwork of warring realms. King Alfred's dream would become his people's destiny. Alfred's legacy endured far beyond his death. His son Edward the Elder and daughter Athelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, carried the torch of his vision. Athelflaed, one of history's most remarkable, yet often forgotten leaders, ruled with both steel and wisdom. She built fortresses across Mercia, striking deep into Viking-held territories, reclaiming towns and hearts alike. Her courage was the spark that reignited the hope of a united land. Historians still debate whether England's birth began under her banner rather than her brother's, but her influence was undeniable. Together, Edward and Athelflaed expanded Wessex's reach, driving the Norse back beyond the rivers and reclaiming the heartlands for the English. By the time Athelstan, Alfred's grandson, took the throne, the dream had nearly become reality. In 937 AD, that dream was tested at the Battle of Brunanburh, a colossal clash that would decide the fate of the island. The kings of Scotland, Strathclyde, and the Norse rallied to crush Athelstan's growing power. But the English king met them with unflinching resolve. The battle was brutal, its fields soaked in blood and legend. The chroniclers would later write that no greater slaughter had ever been seen in this island. Yet when the smoke cleared, it was Athelstan who stood victorious. For the first time, all of England from the northern hills to the southern shores was united under one crown. It was not just a political victory, it was a spiritual one. A people who had survived centuries of invasion, division, and despair now stood as one. The name England, the land of the Angles, began to echo across the chronicles. But the cost of unity was high. The kings who followed, from Edgar the Peaceful to Ethelred the Unready, would struggle to hold together what had been so painfully built. The Vikings returned, not as raiders but as conquerors once more. The great Danish king Knut would one day rule England, followed by chaos, betrayal, and the infamous Norman conquest of 1066 when William the Conqueror's armies ended the Anglo-Saxon age forever. Yet even in defeat, the Saxons left behind something indestructible. Their laws, their language, and their spirit endured. The English tongue, born from Saxon roots and shaped by Norse and Norman influence, became the voice of a people who refused to be erased. Their art, their faith, their courage continued to ripple through the centuries, carried in every word and every story told upon that island. And so, the story of the Anglo-Saxons is not one of loss, but of transformation. They came as strangers, became settlers, and ended as the founders of a nation that would shape the world. Their kings rose and fell, their battles faded into legend, but the essence of who they were, resilient, curious, brave, lived on. Even now, their echoes are found in the stones of old churches, in place names that whisper of ancient tribes, in the rhythms of the language we speak. Time may have buried their world beneath centuries of change, but listen closely, and you can still hear the beating heart of England's beginnings. Because in the end, history is not dead, it sleeps. Beneath the soil, beneath the words, beneath the stories we tell, it waits for those willing to remember. The Anglo-Saxons remind us that from chaos can come unity, from darkness can rise dawn, and from the forgotten past can be reborn an enduring spirit. And as the mist settles over the ancient hills once more, their legacy whispers through the ages, a quiet truth that binds all who walk that storied land. Because the past is never truly gone, it's waiting to be reborn.